My, let's say, aim for today is just to offer you some food for thoughts, as Paolo put it, for the homing group and for the colleagues working on similar or related topics, so that we can kind of open up a discussion about a series of notions that I hope will become clearer in my speech. So what I'm talking about today will be divided into 3 steps, let's say. First step, I'll spend a few words about this notion of threshold and what I call the threshold topology. What is it, a threshold? What type of space is it? And this is a part in which I'll be reviewing basically some classics. I believe very much that the classics are a place to go back recurrently and repeatedly to find inspiration. A little bit like last year, I remember I invited Paolo to speak about the famous excursus on the stranger in Georg Simmel. So we go back to these places. I'm pretty much sure everybody of you is already acquainted, but just, sometimes it's good to go back to certain original formulations, certain passages that can still be quite inspirational. And then I'm gonna talk second a little bit about some examples of urban thresholds, more specifically. So where is it that we see these thresholds phenomena in the city? It will be a very general kind of review, not very general, actually very specific, but selecting some cases that might or might not speak to your empirical data, the kind of project that you're involved in trying to develop. So here is where I'm just really trying to spawn some possibility for you to come in and say, okay, yes, we are seeing something similar, or no, we're seeing something different. And finally, some concluding thoughts to wrap up the stuff. And let's see. Let me begin with a late 19th century source, a little known source. I'm pretty much sure the only person in the room who really knows this source is Matthias, because he's the person who made me encounter this author. He's a little known and forgotten author because he's not a prominent one. His by name is Henry Klein Trumbull. He was not a professional anthropologist. In fact, he was a clergyman, and he was most importantly associated with the Sunday school movement in the US. But he wrote an astounding number of books, including this one, The Threshold Covenant, from 1896. And it's interesting to read this book because it collects a number of, in a very disorderly manner, we could say, but a number of anthropological sources that can still be of interest. And so I'm reading a passage from the very first pages of this book where Trumbull introduces this notion of the covenant that is created by crossing a threshold. In Syria and Egypt, Trumbull writes, at the present time, so it's the late 19th century, when a guest who is worthy of special honor is to be welcomed to a home, the blood of a slaughtered or sacrificed animal is shed on the threshold of that home as a means of adopting the newcomer into the family or of making a covenant union with it. And every such primitive covenant in blood includes an appeal to the protecting deity to ratify it as between the two parties and himself. So it's a three-party relationship to the host, the guest and the host, and the deity. So how does this work? The description follows. While the guest is still outside of the home, the host takes a lamb or a goat and, tying its feet together, lays it upon the threshold of his door. Resting his left knee upon the bound victim, the host holds its head by his left hand, while with his right hand he cuts its throat. He retains his position until all the blood has flowed from the body upon the threshold. Then the victim is removed and the guest steps over the blood across the threshold. And in this act he becomes, as it were, a member of the family by the threshold covenant. So there are quite many interesting anthropological elements here, I think. There are sources that are much more known, like the famous essay by Pierre Bourdieu on the Kabyle house, where he also describes the threshold as this kind of crucial location between the inside and the outside, and the two halves of the world, the male and female, and so on and so forth. But here I think it's very interesting that we have a number of elements, including the idea that the door articulates, and the door is also remarked by this element, which is a very intense element. It's the blood of the sacrificed animal. So it's a blood ritual, certainly, and it's a ritual also, if you want, of passage. How is it that you can position in a way the stranger vis-à-vis the family, the outsider vis-à-vis the insiders? The threshold here appears as a space where certain critical elements occur, certain critical events. And it's also interesting to go, for instance, in a very different context to this ideogram, Japanese ideogram, the ma, which is the negative space, or if you want, the gap, which again is composed by two very ancient Chinese ideograms, which are the door, the space in between, and the sun, which once combined give this ma ideogram, which is the space, the disruption, if you want, the gap, the missing space, the negative space. And the threshold is something like this. We have this spatial, even architectural, if you want, opening through, and you have this sun element, this intensity, which is also blood, if you want. Something it is remarked. It is remarked by, if you want, this even excessive thing, this excessive moment, which is the cutting of the throat of the victim. The two elements, I think, must coexist in order to have a real threshold. So you would have, if you want, this sort of control of space, and there's a whole tradition in human geography, going back, for instance, to Robert Sack, that has emphasized how territory is an attempt at controlling certain space, at controlling the passage point within the space. And here you would have this. The threshold is a way of controlling the access of the stranger to the home territory, if you want, but then you would also have this sun, if you want, element, this hot, intense moment where there is certain signification. You remember, for instance, Jesus Christ said, "I am the door," meaning that I am the right passage, the orthodox entrance, the sanctified entrance to the house of the Lord. There is this saying that the thief never enters through the door. The thieves access the house through a number of lateral, unsanctified, practical passages, but never the official threshold, never the official entry door. So there is this dimension of control of this space, the right way of entering, and as well as, of course, entering a covenant, as Trumbull stresses in his book, the covenant of hospitality, which is very relevant, I think, for you studying homing processes. What does it mean to be a host? Of course, the Latin root and the Latin word is very interesting because it creates this symmetry. Hospes is both the guest and the host at the same time. So you would have this, if you want, structuralist symmetry mediated, if you want, by this intense, excessive element, which has to be managed. In a way, it's all about distance management. And here we would see that, for instance, like an author like Elias Canetti has insisted very much on how is it that humans create distances among themselves in order to manage, if you want, the intensity of the social intercourse, to create some sort of positionality, meaning, hierarchy. All these things come to be inscribed in this potentially tense situation. The threshold also, if you want, is a kind of magical operator, transforming the outsider into an insider. How is it that you do it? And inherently there is this excessive element that I want also go back to, for instance, like the paradox that by entering the threshold and entering the covenant of hospitality, the threshold covenant, as Trumbull puts it, puts the host in a kind of even the kind of hospitality is itself excessive. So there are stories, a number of stories related to how the host is protected to an even greater extent than the family members themselves. To the point that, for instance, if a member of the family makes a snitch about a host that is currently protected, then it's the son of the family that is killed in order to protect the host, which is even more sacred than. It's a very strange and complex, but very intense situation. The other, sorry, I misspelled Zimmel. It's unforgivable on my part. It's Zimmel with two M. I only notice it now. But this beautiful short essay. Zimmel was famous for writing this incredibly acute essays where he articulates these two forms, the bridge and the door, and it describes how humans are the creators of these entities which are not present in nature. How is it so? Because, they say, the human being is the connecting creature who must always separate and cannot connect without separating. And that is why we must first conceive intellectually of the merely indifferent existence of two riverbanks as something separated in order to connect them by means of a bridge. Which means that if we could interview in our dream world as sociologists, if we could interview the fish, then the fish would not perceive the need of a bridge, of course, because they inhabit the middle, right, of the river, and so they do not perceive that the riverbanks are separated in any meaningful way. It is only humans who perceive this cleft, this gap, if you want, this space, and by feeling this separation, they also feel the urge to span this separation and build a bridge that connects the two banks, that creates this connectivity. And Zimmel elaborates on this kind of paradoxical situation of the human being where, of course, building the span implies recognizing the separation. And this is the drama and also the conflict of modern culture, as in many occasions Zimmel called it. There is, however, an interesting asymmetry between the bridge and the door, which I want to draw your attention on in the essay. Zimmel writes, and the human being is likewise the bordering creature who has no border. The enclosure of his or her domestic being by the door means to be sure that they have separated out a piece from the uninterrupted unity of natural being. This is a theme that recurs again in Zimmel, for instance, in his famous essay on the landscape, where he says the landscape does not exist in nature because nature is continuous. It is only by perceiving some sort of discontinuity, by interrupting, by creating unity of something out of the continuous, on the continuity of nature that we can have a landscape. And here it says something similar about the door. The enclosure of his or her domestic being by the door means to be sure that they have separated out a piece from the uninterrupted unity of natural being. But just as the formless limitation takes on shape, its limitedness finds its significance and dignity only in that which the mobility of the door illustrates, namely in the possibility at any moment of stepping out of this limitation into freedom. This, if you want, is, for example, the, even if you want, more intense moment of the bridge vis-a-vis of the door vis-a-vis the bridge. That is, that in its limitedness, if you want, in its restriction, in its and it's also the drama of doors, if you want, that we always cross into other trajectories at the doors, because if you want, to use a mathematical terminology, we could say that the door is a singularity. It's a singularity because it's a kind of space that swallows up a larger space. You have to go through this bottleneck. The door is a bottleneck, if you want. It conveys a number of scattered phenomena across space into the necessity of really going through that passage. So the symbol is also what makes the door even more interesting than the bridge, because you create the possibility of having a number of trajectories that are recreated just at the door, because you step out of this limitation into freedom. And freedom here should be really read into a kind of physical understanding of degrees of freedom. So the possibility of angles that you create when you step out of the door. You could go, into a number of 180 degrees trajectories. So this is another interesting point. It makes no difference in meaning in which direction one crosses a bridge, whereas the door displays a complete difference of intention between entering and exiting. So the asymmetry of the door is also created by this fact that you can cross a bridge in any of the two directions, but the door is always somehow perceived that there is a direction that means exiting and a direction that means entering. And again, this goes back to Trumbull, the covenant threshold. If you enter, then you enter a covenant. You enter a particular social bond, a particular social structure. If you exit, you leave, and then you are going to a number of possibilities of trajectories and stuff. And this is probably the meaning, one of the reasons why entering is so much remarked. It's even excessively, as I said, stamped in blood. And all rituals of entering, for instance, traditional rituals of entering, for instance, the fresh bride who is taken by the groom, and she doesn't have to touch ground on the threshold, because there is this leap of faith into this new dimension. She is entering into a new household, into a new possibility, into a new type of existence. So there is a sharp distinction made possible by directionality. Of course, there are many bridges across the world, and one could argue that in many cases crossing the bridge actually reproduces this sharp distinction between entering and exiting. When you're crossing the Bosphorus bridge, then are you entering Europe in that moment? Is this, if you are a European, you have some feeling that something happens in crossing this peculiar bridge, and there are bridges across the world where direction matters a lot. So we could say that this is an analytical distinction, not an empirical one, and we could find, if you want, a kind of door flavor to many bridges and many ensuing asymmetries. Let me move to Walter Benjamin, or Walter Benjamin, as the Americans said. The Arcades project is, as you know, an unfinished project that Benjamin went on collecting in this huge, over 1,000 page archive, and never managed to complete. And he probably didn't. If he never managed to complete it, it's because he didn't want to complete it. He wanted to do something new, and unfortunately he had to leave the manuscript to Georges Bataille while he was fleeing from Paris at the beginning of the war, and moved to Marseille, and then tried to escape to the US through the Spanish border, which he could not do. In the Arcades project, of course, there are many themes. It's like a super meal where you can find all you want, and of course there is a specific interest in thresholds and in strange spaces like the passage, and like this strange existence of space in the case. In the case, I mean the case as a container. And Benjamin writes, the 19th century, like no other century, was addicted to dwelling. So this is interesting for you who are studying homing and dwelling practices. The 19th century, says Benjamin, had a strange relationship to dwelling, and it created a whole constellation around this notion of dwelling. It conceived the residence as a receptacle for the person. So there is this very close matching between the person and his home range, if you want, in the ethological sense. It encased him, actually. It put it into a Gehäuse, writes Benjamin, encased him with all his appurtenances so deeply in the dwelling's interior that one might be reminded of the inside of a compass case. You remember these cases where we put precious instruments, precious tools, where the instrument with all its accessories lies embedded in deep, usually violet folds of velvet. So we have this beautiful imagination of this case, and imagination of the home as a case. A human being is, like put as if it were a compass or a golden instrument, or a golden watch. The watch which you have inherited from your grandfather, and you put it like a relic, like something sacred that comes from the past. You want to handle it carefully. You want to put it into a velvet that preserve it from any shock. And the idea of dwelling in the 19th century for Benjamin is very much related to this protected interiority. Today, for instance, Peter Sloterdijk has developed a whole philosophy of a space related to precisely this idea of microsphere, of form, topology, that we are encased, we are protected into our own apartments, into our own flats, into our own houses, as if we were, stored in a case. It's very interesting. What did not the 19th century invent some sort of casing for? And then Benjamin goes on to enumerate all the stuff that had been put into cases: watches, compasses, all sorts of equipments that has been stored into beautiful equipments. Of course, Benjamin was a collector. He was interested in this kind of bourgeois collections, in this he was coming from the upper Berlin bourgeoisie, and so it was, it was grown up in this sort of this luscious and precious upper middle class interiors. So he knew perfectly what he was talking about. He had this idea that the interior of the bourgeois dwelling, of the middle class dwelling, was a case, protected from the shocks of the outside in a way. And my connection with the case is also, for the sociologist, the connection to Max Weber. Because when Max Weber described what is usually translated into English is the iron cage of rationality, he was actually using the word Gehäuse, case, the iron case of rationality. So he had in mind something very similar, and it's not excluded that it was influenced somehow by Simmel, who was a friend of Weber, and in turn Benjamin was very much influenced by by Simmel, as we know. And there is a very ending of this passage. There are some sentences in between, but I just wanted to remind you that the 20th century for Benjamin looked quite differently. Today, this word has disappeared entirely, he writes, and dwelling has diminished. We have lost the capacity to dwell for Benjamin. For the living, it has diminished through hotel rooms. So we ended up in hotel rooms. For the dead, through crematoriums. And Benjamin, wrote these lines before the Holocaust. He didn't live long enough to see through it, but certainly we have this uncanny feeling that something terrible is happening in the 20th century, and this might be related somehow to this symmetry of living and to these strange new spaces for dwelling that have been created for the living and for the dead, as also James Joyce writes in the famous novel Dead. So the autumn room is a very interesting configuration, because in a way the autumn room in itself has tried to reproduce some sort of anesthesia, which is very common kind of feeling we experience when we live in these anonymous interiors, which have a lot of velvet usually to it, and we are trying to preserve our privacy as much as possible. They're trying to preserve this sort of comfort as much as possible. But as we know, outer rooms are a very difficult place to actually dwell. Remember, there was a whole generation in the early 20th century of intellectuals and artists living in hotels and stuff, and what does it mean to try to make your home in a hotel? That could be a very interesting research question also for you. I forgot to translate this passage, but here, but Benjamin is also this is a different section of the Passagenberg on the work of the arcades, and but Benjamin says that we have become very poor in Schwellen Erfahrungen, in threshold experiences. So we've become poor in this type of experience of the threshold space. And he says the threshold must be distinguished from the border, because the threshold is actually a zone. So it opens up the possibility of thinking about the threshold not simply as this just instant conversion moment, but also as this lingering moment. And Ben was certainly someone who was very much lingering all his life through. He never achieved anything conclusively, but he also says Wanderübergang and wandering and transformation and if you want transformation and flooding and overflow or flooding, but also floating, if you want, are inscribed in the meaning of the word threshold, and this meaning must and the etymology of this meaning must be not overlooked. On the other hand, it says it's also necessary. To keep in mind the immediate tectonic and ceremonial meaning of the word, which is conveyed by which is conveyed by the meaning of the word. So it distinguishes two kind of traditions inside this notion of threshold. On the one hand, it says there is this ceremonial thing, and he's referring precisely to anthropology and to the rites of passage and to Vagenet work on the rites of passage, the transition space between the inside and the outside, or the transition between two different status inside a social structure, initiation rites, all these sort of things, and the architectonic, if you want, architectonic meaning, the kind of thing we've seen before, the house as this kind of interiority separated from an exteriority, and the necessity of meaningfully articulating the stuff. But on the other hand, and this is the part that is more known, but on the other hand, it says there is also this other possibility, this wandering, this overflowing, this flooding, this floating, this transformation, transition, this, if you want, also metamorphosis that is implied by the threshold topology. And here is probably thinking somehow more along the lines of psychoanalysis. He was interested in the work of Sigmund Freud. He was interested also in the work of Carl Gustav Jung. So the possibility that the threshold has very much to do with also with the unconscious, the transition between the conscious and the unconscious. And in fact, when he says we have become very poor of threshold experiences, he says one of the very few moments in our daily life where we experience thresholds is when we fall asleep. It's a very mundane occurrence of crossing the threshold, but it speaks of this possibility of the threshold as a kind of regime, if you want, of a regime of existence, of a regime of consciousness. Let me turn to another very important thing that we all know. Victor Turner, the British anthropologist, The Ritual Process, very important book, when he recalls the anthropological tradition that goes from Vagenet. Incidentally, Vagenet was also quoting Trumbull, which was using Trumbull as a source. Vagenet has shown that all rites of passage or transition are marked by three phases, which he describes as separation, margin or limen, signifying threshold in Latin. He refined his notion of liminality or threshold condition, and aggregation. So the three steps whereby you change status in an initiation rite or something like that. And the attributes of liminality or liminal personae, threshold people, are necessarily ambiguous, since this condition and these persons elude or slip through the network of classifications that normally indicate states and positions in cultural space. This is a trope that Turner develops famously into his distinctions between societas and communitas, and he describes this dialectic between society as an organized existence, whereby you inscribe differences of status, differences of professional specialization or division of labor, of all sorts of inequality of wealth, and all the distinctions that make up the classifications of society, drawing back to a kind of Durkheimian origin, if you want. And on the other hand, this communal existence, these community things, and he recurrently underlines how this communitas experience, which it tries to use the Latin word arguably to distinguish it from community, which is something already accomplished. He wants to emphasize that communitas of community, the communality, if you want, emerges out of from a number of directions. So if you want, it erupts into the society as established creature through its cracks, if you want, the thresholds, through its margins, the marginal people, and through its, it says also, the underdogs, if you want, so through the poor, the powers of the subjected, the powers of the subjugated, the powers of the inferior, he calls it. So we are presented in such rights with a moment in and out of time and in and out of secular social structure. So the liminal existence, the threshold existence for Turner is exactly one of these moments where society crumbles, if you want, which reveals, however fleetingly, some recognition in symbol, if not always in language, of, this is a very important phrase in Turner, generalized social bond that ceases to be simultaneously yet to be fragmented into a multiplicity of structural ties. So what I was saying before, society existed in this fragmented and in this fragmentation and in this multiplicity of structural ties, but there are moments in between, if you want, in between, when there appears something different, which Turner calls generalized social bond. It's a very mysterious phrase because we don't know what a generalized social bond is, apart from the many manifestations that it practically has. Are we connected as friends or are we connected as enemies? Once we recognize that being enemies is also a way of connecting to each other, sociology of conflict has taught us, but what does it mean to be connected in a general social way? So that is the very mysterious part. Let me move very quickly to some sort of illustration of how this threshold experience might be ingrained into the space of the city, and this is somehow related for me to the existence of interstices. I think Turner makes it powerfully the case that thresholds are, if you want, interstices, are in-betweens, in-between spaces or ill-defined spaces that somehow exist between other zones. In a piece that I've co-authored with Paolo, which used to be an introduction to a special issue on homemaking, one of the many that Paolo has curated, but he was very kind of inviting me to join this effort, and what I brought in was this very interesting photographic exploration that Eugène Ager conducted in the hill-defined zones of Paris at the end of the 19th century up until the beginning of the First World War, and these were the cycle known as les Zoniers, and the les Zoniers are the people who used to live in this zona non edificandi. Technically speaking, this part of the city just outside the urban walls of Paris, which by law could not have been built because it was a zone that, when it came to the original mission of the urban wall, that is protecting the city from military aggressions, it was essential that you had this empty, blank space at which you could keep the enemy in the military aggression, and then this space could have been bombed very easily, but the actual city could not be reached. So it's a kind of, if you want, immunity space for the city from the very military, architectonic military point of view. But what happened is that, of course, increasingly the pressure to inhabit the city brings new inhabitants, attracts immigrants to the city, and settlers settle. This has happened very much in many capitals of Europe, and in Rome, for instance, up until the end of the Second World War. And of course, the type of immigrants that we find in these places used to live. And it's very striking that if we go back just 100 years from today, 100 years, at the entrance of one of the greatest capital of Europe, Paris, you would find, people living in caravans. Not few people, but many people. I mean, a new wave of urban dwellers living in these ill-defined zones. And you recall the definition by Walter Benjamin, the threshold is a zone. So this is, I just placed some of these
these are the zones, and there are of course the gates of the city. So if you can map these places. I try to visit also these places today and took pictures of how they look today, because it's very interesting. Usually they are metro stations, of course, and they are. But do they still carry some sort of threshold aspect to them? Of course, the passage were a very different space, threshold space. Walter Benjamin was much more attracted by, and he described this passage as a kind of extended interiority, extended strange bourgeois kind of space, but also very ambiguous one. The arcades are covered by glass, and it doesn't rain inside, but even when there's sun outside, the weather is still kind of uncertain, so you don't really live a real sense of exteriority. You don't live, it's not a real indoor, it's not a real outdoors. It's a kind of strange shadow space. And again, it conveys again this notion of transition, articulation, and you could go back to the nouns used by Walter Benjamin. Of course, it connects it very much also to the unconscious space, to the dream space, also to the fossil space. What type of fossilization is described in these spaces? And moving to the New World, moving to the US, another very classic resource is Frederick Thrasher from the Chicago School. The book is called The Gang. It's an ethnography of gangs, 1,313 gangs in Chicago. And Thrasher describes this situation. What is the space this gang inhabits? He calls it urban prairies. So again, it's a kind of strange space if you look at it from an urban perspective, because we are used to imagine the city through its built environment, through its plans, through its master plans, through its governance space, through its infrastructure, through the provision of electricity, water, connections, mobility, metro, and so on and so forth. But here we would have this kind of nature, the prairie, this kind of natural space. So what does it mean to look at the city through its natural ecology, if you want, to its natural history, and which kind of entity are these gangs, these if you want, packs of youngsters that self-organize and move around these spaces, try to control their turf, control their space, and above all control their own mobility through the city. It's very interesting here. You would have really like a path, a pathway that is designed, is what the urban planners call a desire line, because it's created by people walking through it, right? So it's cut through the grass, and by people stamping their feet on this, you have a passage, which is not designed, it's created by the movement. So you would also have this, and more recently, of course, the interesting space of the playground. Here is beautiful picture I discovered very recently by Don Bach, a British educator who also worked with Collingwood, anarchist, urban planner, author, and this is Notting Hill actually, it's London. So it's what they call an adventure playground. There's a whole tradition of these, Matthias taught me about these junkyards or junk playgrounds where urban kids really experimented. Today to have a 5-year-old kid that set fire and starts a bonfire. We're not used to this level of insecurity. This fact that kids do incredible things, and they self-regulating stunning ways, and so there is this sort of also this kind of edgy feeling, this sort of experimental space out there. And a few more from an article that I've co-authored with Matthias. Picture can be provided by Jesper Magnusson, Matthias' colleague. Recent picture of the playgrounds. There's a strong tradition of playgrounds in Amsterdam. Aldo van Eyck was a modernist architect associated with SIAM, the Centre International d'Architecture Moderne, so the generation of Le Corbusier and this modernist attitude. But Van Eyck was also interested in experimenting with open spaces where actually kids are to self-manage. So the interesting thing about Van Eyck's playgrounds is that they're not fenced. They're not cut out from the urban continuum. They are designed to be threshold space, constantly. And the difficulty, of course, is how do different populations coexist through this public space, which is still a playground space. So today that we are so much obsessed by control, security, sorting population by type, and preventing dangerous proximities to happen. This is certainly an interesting legacy. And because Paolo kindly put this picture in the seminar for the seminar, I picked this picture for the seminar flyer. Wanted to recognize also this input from Stavros Stavridis, a very good friend from Athens, author of this nice book towards the city of thresholds. And I put the original picture, not the doctored one, because he then put on the background a number of skyscrapers, and he wanted to, by editing this, doctoring this picture, he wanted to emphasize the distinction between a city that has no longer a human scale and a kind of city where all sorts of loiterers, we could say, appropriate public space, creating these threshold spaces. And of course, the difficulty with thresholds and with public spaces more generally is that they are on the threshold also this covenant, which is the pact, if you want, which is the deal, which is the regulation that applies to these sort of situations, to this sort of occupations of public space. Is not public space something that is always strained between movement of appropriations, if you want, and resistance against this appropriation, these occupiers for a number of reasons, for a number of motivations, and for a different amount and for different magnitudes of occupation. The people just want to play chess in public. The people just want to play football in public, the famous Super Santos in Naples, and the people who instead want to occupy, the famous Occupy movement, for making a strong claim, for making a public claim, for political reasons. So there is an ample, a whole array of possibilities, a quite stretched range of occupiers. But is it not public space the possibility itself of reversing this occupation? Otherwise, what would distinguish this occupation from just a privatization? So this is the difficulty, that it's not clear. By occupying, of course, you privatize. And if you want to make yourself at home, you inherently create some frictions with others' understanding of home and homeliness and their own way of feeling at home. So how many ways of feeling at home can public space accommodate? And this is kind of final thought that I think I can stop here, because it has been longer than expected. But
didn't stop me. Blame is a power. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrea.